The atmosphere in the police station was as stale as the coffee in Detective Sarah Williams' cup. She was about to wrap up her shift when her phone buzzed with an incoming email. The sender was anonymous. The subject line read, "Urgent. Information on the missing Mark Thompson case." 10 years had passed since Mark Thompson, a local resident, vanished without a trace. A decade with no leads, no suspects, and no closure for a grieving family and community. Sarah opened the email cautiously. It read, "Check the cabin at Horseshoe Trail. You'll find what you're looking for there." No signature, no additional context. A shiver went down her spine. She looked around the office. Most of her colleagues had already gone home for the night. For a moment, she pondered the legitimacy of the email. Could this be another wild goose chase, or was it the break they'd been waiting for all these years? Shaking off her doubts, she grabbed her coat and headed for the door. She informed the desk sergeant she might be late coming in tomorrow, jumped into her car, and set the GPS for Horseshoe Trail. As she drove, the weight of the decade-old case pressed down on her. The town had never been the same after Mark's disappearance, and neither had Sarah. This was one of the first cases she worked on as a detective, and the failure to solve it had haunted her career. When she finally arrived at the isolated trail, she parked her car and flicked on her flashlight. Her breath misted in the chilly night air as she followed the path leading to the cabin. Tonight, she thought, could be the night they finally got some answers. But as she neared the decrepit wooden cabin at the end of the trail, she also understood that she might be walking into a grim revelation that could reopen a decade-old wound for the whole community. Sarah stepped cautiously onto the porch, the floorboards creaking under her weight. She drew her gun and nudged the cabin door open with her foot. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside, bracing herself for whatever lay ahead. Sarah's pulse quickened as she cautiously navigated the dilapidated cabin, her flashlight cutting through the blanket of darkness. A smell of mildew and rot pervaded the atmosphere, and every creak of the wooden floor beneath her feet seemed amplified. Everything in the cabin was covered in a thick layer of dust, a silent testimony to years of abandonment, except for one conspicuous detail. Her flashlight beam landed on a corner of the room where the earth appeared freshly disturbed. Her instincts told her this was no mere coincidence. Something, or someone, had recently been here. Without hesitation, Sarah set down her flashlight on a nearby table and pulled out a folding shovel from her utility bag. Her hands trembled slightly as she began to dig, her mind racing through the possible scenarios of what she might find. Minutes felt like hours, until her shovel finally hit something solid. With a sense of dread and anticipation, she unearthed a rusted metal box. Her hands shook as she pried it open to reveal its contents: an old cell phone, a wallet, and a tarnished locket. The locket contained a faded photograph of Mark Thompson and Emily, his high school sweetheart. A wave of realization washed over Sarah. These were more than just relics. They were pieces of a decade-old puzzle that had plagued the community, a silent scream from the past begging to be heard. As she stood there staring at the unearthed secrets, Sarah knew that she had just cracked open a case that would awaken a town's long-buried demons. The clock was ticking, and Sarah felt the weight of the unresolved mystery more acutely than ever. She carefully placed the items back into the box and sealed it, her mind already racing ahead to the inevitable storm that was about to engulf the town. The questions loomed large. Why were these items buried here? What happened to Mark? And most crucially, who had sent her the anonymous tip that led her to this hidden cache? The search for answers was about to plunge Sarah into a labyrinth of deceit, hidden motives, and unspeakable truths. But for now, she had evidence, a tangible link to the past, and that was a start. As Sarah drove back into town, the rusted metal box sat in the passenger seat like a ticking time bomb. Her thoughts were a chaotic whirlpool of questions and suspicions. She decided her first move would be to bring the box to the local police station. Though she had reservations about involving the authorities, this evidence could potentially solve a 10-year-old cold case. Upon entering the station, Sarah was greeted by Officer Davis, an amiable but stern figure who had been a fixture in the community for years. "Good evening, Sarah," he greeted, eyeing the box. "What brings you in at this late hour?" Taking a deep breath, Sarah unveiled the box and its contents. As Davis laid eyes on the photograph in the locket, his complexion turned a shade paler. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern and disbelief. "In an old cabin in the woods," Sarah responded, her eyes meeting his. "An anonymous tip led me there." Davis looked visibly shaken. "This could reopen old wounds, Sarah. Are you sure you want to dig deeper?" Sarah nodded. Someone wanted me to find this, and it's high time we resolve what's been haunting this town for years. With a reluctant sigh, Davis agreed to move forward with a formal investigation, cautioning Sarah to keep her discovery under wraps for the time being. Sarah left the station with a heavy heart, but also a newfound sense of purpose. She couldn't shake off the feeling that she was being watched, but fear was now eclipsed by a determination to solve the puzzle. Sarah's first stop was the Thompson residence, the childhood home of Mark. As she stood before the aging Victorian house, she hesitated. Mark's mother, Mrs. Thompson, was known to be a fragile woman, haunted by her son's mysterious disappearance. Sarah knocked gently on the door, and a moment later, Mrs. Thompson appeared. "Oh, it's you, Sarah," she greeted weakly, her face lined with years of sorrow. "May I come in? I have something important to discuss." Once inside, Sarah carefully broached the subject, showing Mrs. Thompson the locket. The reaction was instantaneous. Mrs. Thompson's face contorted as if she'd been slapped. "Where did you find this?" she gasped. "In a cabin in the woods," Sarah replied softly, along with Mark's old cell phone and wallet. Mrs. Thompson seemed to deflate like a punctured balloon, her eyes welling up with tears. "So it's true then. He's never coming back." Leaving the Thompson residence, Sarah couldn't shake off the weight of the old wounds she had just reopened. As she got into her car, her phone buzzed. A new message popped up. It was an anonymous text. "Good job, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. Dig deeper." The past was screaming louder than ever, and Sarah had no choice but to listen. But who was guiding her through this maze, and what did they hope she would find? With each passing moment, the maze seemed to grow more intricate, and Sarah knew she had no choice but to forge ahead into its darkening corridors. Sarah's phone buzzed again, the anonymous message still fresh on the screen. Her heart pounded as she made her next move. She decided to revisit Mark's circle of friends from that fateful summer. The closest to him had been Ben, who had provided an alibi for the night of Mark's disappearance. Sarah pulled up to Ben's rundown house. Paint was peeling off the walls, and the lawn was overgrown. She knocked. The door creaked open to reveal Ben, now a grown man with a disheveled appearance. His eyes widened upon seeing Sarah. "What brings you here?" "We need to talk about Mark," she said, cutting to the chase. Ben's face twisted into an expression she couldn't quite read. "I told the police everything 10 years ago. I had nothing to do with his disappearance." "Maybe, but something new has come up," Sarah replied, revealing the locket and other items. "Do you recognize these?" Ben stared at the locket for what felt like an eternity. His eyes looked hollow, almost lifeless. Then he spoke, his voice shaky. "I can't help you, Sarah. Some doors are better left unopened." Just then, Sarah heard it, a soft, faint whisper coming from somewhere inside the house. Her eyes darted past Ben, trying to peer into the dark interior. "Is someone else here?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion and fear. Ben's eyes widened, and for the first time, Sarah saw a flicker of genuine terror cross his face. "You need to leave, now." Ignoring his warning, Sarah pushed past him, her heart racing as she moved further into the house. The whisper grew louder, morphing into a discernible chant, a repetition of a single, haunting phrase. "Don't look back, don't look back." Sarah followed the sound, her footsteps guided by some primal instinct. She found herself standing in front of a closed door at the end of a dark hallway. The chanting seemed to emanate from behind it. Hand trembling, Sarah opened the door. What she found made her blood run cold. A shrine-like setup was before her, covered in old photographs of Mark, candles, and disturbing sketches. At the center of this unsettling tableau was a single, worn-out chair with ropes hanging loosely on its arms. Ben appeared behind her, his face ashen. "I told you to leave. You've reopened wounds that never healed." Sarah turned to face him, her eyes wide with horror. "What is this, Ben? What did you do?" Before Ben could answer, the room itself seemed to come alive. The candles flickered erratically, and the haunting chant filled the air, louder now, almost as if it was coming from the walls themselves. Both felt a rush of icy air, as if a window had been thrown open in the dead of winter. But no windows were open. The horror was coming from within the room. The chanting reached a feverish pitch, and the photographs of Mark began to curl at the edges, as if being burned by an invisible flame. The room darkened, the shadows growing thicker and more oppressive. Suddenly, the chair in the middle of the room fell over on its own, and the chanting stopped as abruptly as it had started. Both Sarah and Ben were paralyzed, frozen in a state of absolute terror. It was clear now. The past had awoken something truly sinister, and Sarah knew that solving Mark's disappearance was no longer just a matter of justice, it was a matter of life and death. She backed away, her eyes never leaving Ben's. "This isn't over," she said, her voice quivering. As she exited the house, Sarah felt a sinking feeling deep within her soul. She had ventured into a realm of darkness she couldn't fully comprehend, but there was no turning back now. Whoever or whatever was behind this horror was deeply intertwined with the tragedy of Mark's disappearance, and Sarah had just scratched the surface. The night was dark, but the terror that loomed was darker still. As she drove away, another anonymous message flashed on her phone. "Deeper still, Sarah. The real horror is yet to come." And for the first time, Sarah was unsure if she had the courage to face it. Sarah's mind was a storm of conflicting emotions as she drove away from Ben's house. Her phone buzzed again, displaying another cryptic message, but she ignored it. For now, she needed answers from a different source. Emily, Mark's ex-girlfriend and the last person to see him alive. Emily lived in a modest suburban home, a stark contrast to Ben's rundown house. Sarah was welcomed inside, where Emily sat her down in the living room. "Sarah, you look like you've seen a ghost," Emily said, offering her a glass of water. "In a way, I have," Sarah replied, recounting the horror she'd witnessed at Ben's house. Emily's face turned pale as she listened. I didn't know it had gone this far," Emily stuttered, visibly shaken. "You knew something, though, didn't you?" Sarah pressed. Emily hesitated, then sighed deeply, as if letting go of a burden she'd carried for years. "Mark had issues, deep-rooted issues. He talked to me about strange visions, nightmares that seemed too real. I never took it seriously until he disappeared." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "And you never thought to mention this to anyone?" Emily shook her head, tears filling her eyes. "I was scared. Scared of being blamed, scared of digging deeper into whatever that dark world was." Sarah felt her frustration boiling over but held it back. Emily was clearly terrified, and Sarah couldn't discount the possibility that Emily herself might be another victim in this whole horrifying ordeal. "Just tell me one thing," Sarah said softly. "Did Mark ever speak of a place or a name that seemed important to him? Something he was obsessed about?" Emily hesitated, then nodded. "There was one name he mentioned during our late-night talks, Alder Creek. He said it was a place where all questions would be answered, where reality and nightmare merged." The room grew cold as she spoke, a palpable chill hanging in the air. The lights flickered briefly, and both women looked around nervously. Emily grabbed Sarah's hand, her grip trembling. "Promise me you'll be careful, Sarah. Some doors, once opened, unleash things that can never be put back." Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of Emily's words settle over her. She left the house with a new destination in mind, Alder Creek. But as she got into her car, she felt a profound sense of dread. If Ben's house was any indication, Emily's warning was not to be taken lightly. The true horror, it seemed, was just beginning, and whatever awaited her at Alder Creek was intimately tied to the decade-old mystery that had claimed her brother and shattered so many lives. Sarah's car pulled onto a dirt road leading to Alder Creek, her hands gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. Emily's haunting words reverberated in her mind. She couldn't shake off the feeling that she was driving straight into the mouth of hell. As she approached, she noticed a solitary figure standing by the creek, Ben. He seemed to be talking to himself, his words lost in the roar of the rushing water. The moment he saw her, a flicker of recognition, and perhaps fear, crossed his face. "Sarah, you shouldn't be here," he shouted as she approached him. "That's exactly what Emily said, but here I am looking for answers. Answers that you owe me, Ben." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a strange mix of guilt and relief. "So you know about Mark's obsession with this place?" "I know enough," Sarah retorted. "Now tell me what happened to my brother. Tell me the truth, all of it." Ben hesitated, and for a moment Sarah thought he would refuse. But then he sighed, as if resigning himself to a fate he couldn't escape. 10 years ago, Mark, Emily, and I came here. Mark was convinced that Alder Creek was a place of great power, that it could give him the answers he was desperately seeking about his visions. And then he performed some sort of ritual. Words were spoken, symbols were drawn. Then Mark walked into the creek and he just disappeared. The water swallowed him whole. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. The horror of it was unimaginable, a fate worse than death. So you and Emily just decided to keep this a secret? To let everyone believe he had run away? We were scared. We were just kids messing with things we didn't understand. We thought we'd be blamed for his disappearance, or worse, accused of something more sinister. Sarah stared at him, rage boiling over. You let us believe he was a coward, that he'd abandoned us. You ruined his memory, turned it into a lie. I'm so sorry, Sarah. I can't change the past, but you need to understand. The creek took something from each of us that night. A part of me has been lost here, forever bound to this cursed place. As if on cue, the atmosphere around them grew dense, and the setting sun gave way to an eerie darkness. Sarah felt an indescribable terror welling up from the depths of the creek, as if the water itself was alive, hungry for another victim. Suddenly the air was pierced by a guttural growl, a sound so inhuman it seemed to come from another realm. Both Sarah and Ben turned to see a shadowy figure emerging from the woods, its eyes glowing an unnatural red. In that moment, Sarah realized the terrifying truth. Alder Creek was not just a place, but a gateway, a thin veil between reality and a darker world beyond. A world her brother had unwittingly entered all those years ago and from which he might never return. As the figure approached, Sarah felt a dread so profound that it threatened to consume her. But she also felt something else. Resolve. She had come too far to turn back now. Whatever horror awaited her, she would face it head-on. And so she braced herself for the confrontation that would either provide her the answers she so desperately sought, or trap her in a never-ending nightmare. Either way, the time for secrets was over. Detective Harris pulled up to Alder Creek the next morning, having been tipped off by an anonymous caller again. He was already on edge from the unresolved events surrounding Mark's disappearance years ago. The first crime scene had never truly left him. He had files upon files of cold cases, but this one haunted him most. As he stepped out of his vehicle, he instantly sensed something was wrong. The same oppressive atmosphere that had plagued his previous visit seemed even more suffocating today. His radio buzzed with static as he tried to communicate with the precinct, and finally he gave up and proceeded on foot. Trudging towards the creek, he caught sight of something shiny embedded in the mud. Bending down, he picked up a locket. Sarah's locket, he realized with a start. His heart sank. Opening it, he found a tiny photograph of Sarah and Mark as kids. The pit in his stomach grew heavier. Further ahead, near the water, were footsteps. 2 sets leading to the creek and only one returning. The detective's experienced eyes also caught sight of symbols etched onto the ground, their meanings elusive but their implications ominous. Then he saw it. Fresh blood smeared on a rock near the water's edge, and scraps of what looked like clothing caught in the overhanging branches. His mind raced through the possibilities, none of which ended well. Just as he was about to call for backup, despite the radio's stubborn interference, he heard a soft rustle behind him. Whirling around, he found himself face to face with Emily. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her eyes filled with a sorrow that chilled Harris to his bones. "Neither should you. What happened here, Emily? Where are Sarah and Ben?" She hesitated, looking towards the creek as if expecting, or fearing, something to emerge. They came looking for answers, the same answers that claimed Mark. Harris felt his frustration boiling over. "That's not good enough. I need to know what happened here. If you know something, now's the time to come clean." Emily looked him straight in the eyes. "Alder Creek isn't just a place, it's a threshold. Some doors should never be opened, Detective. Mark, Sarah, Ben, they all opened a door they couldn't close." The air around them seemed to tighten, as if in agreement with her grim proclamation. Harris felt it, the palpable dread that seemed to seep from the creek itself. "Is there a way to close this door?" he asked, his voice tinged with desperation. "There might be, but the price is unbearable." A cold wind blew through the trees, and Harris felt his skin prickle with goosebumps. It was as if the creek itself was listening, waiting for a decision to be made. As Emily turned to walk away, she dropped a folded piece of paper at his feet. "If you're willing to pay the price, read this. It might give you the closure you seek. But remember, some secrets are better left buried." Detective Harris watched her vanish into the woods, then picked up the paper with trembling hands. As he read the words, a chill ran down his spine. Not just from the horror they spelled out, but from the dawning realization that he would have to choose between unearthing the dark truths of Alder Creek or leaving its cursed waters to claim more souls. The choice was his, and time was running out. Detective Harris stood there, the crumpled paper in his hand and his mind racing. The writing was an incantation, a series of ancient symbols and phrases that claimed to seal the door Emily had spoken of. But it also warned that the one who performed it would be claiming responsibility, the implications of which were left terrifyingly vague. As he made his way back to his car, the police radio finally sputtered back to life. The voice on the other end was one of urgency. "Detective Harris, we found something. You need to get back to the precinct." When he arrived, Captain Miller was waiting for him, his face pale. On the table in the investigation room lay several objects. A knife with what looked like dried blood, Sarah's purse, and a series of photos. "We found these in an old shed near the outskirts of town," Miller said. "I think you should sit down." One by one, Harris looked at the photos, his heart sinking with each image. They were of him, taken from a distance, watching his every move at Alder Creek. The last photo was of him picking up the locket. Someone had been watching him closely, very closely. "Any ideas?" Miller asked. "Too many," Harris muttered, his mind racing through a whirlwind of dark possibilities. He waited until nightfall before returning to Alder Creek, the incantation clutched tightly in his hand. If he was being watched, as the photos clearly suggested, then his every move from here on would not just be dangerous, it would be damning. Once there, the atmosphere was just as he remembered it, thick, heavy, almost watchful. But now he felt an added layer of dread, knowing he was possibly playing into someone or something's hands. Taking a deep breath, he began to read the incantation aloud. The words felt strange on his tongue, a cacophony of syllables and sounds that seemed to reverberate through the very air itself. The ground beneath him began to quiver, and for a moment he thought he heard voices, whispers of pain, cries of despair, emanating from the water. Then, suddenly, a scream pierced the air, echoing in the night. He looked up to find Emily standing on the opposite bank of the creek. "No!" she shrieked. "You don't know what you've done!" Before he could react, a hand erupted from the water, cold, skeletal, lifeless, gripping his ankle with a strength that defied its decaying form. In an instant he was pulled into the creek, the incantation torn from his hands and carried away by the dark waters. As he fought against the pull, desperate for air, he felt another hand grab him, this one warm, living, human. With a jolt, he was pulled back onto the bank, coughing and gasping for air. It was Emily. "Quick, finish it! Finish the incantation!" she screamed, thrusting the soggy paper back into his hands. With a final desperate effort, Harris recited the remaining lines. The hand in the water let out a guttural cry and retreated, disappearing into the depths of the creek. For a moment, there was silence, then Emily collapsed. The next day, Detective Harris found himself at the precinct, a hot cup of coffee in his hand but no warmth in his heart. Emily had died, the life seemingly drained out of her the moment the incantation was complete. The official cause was unknown, but Harris knew better. He also knew that the whispers had stopped, the dread at Alder Creek somewhat lifted. But as he looked into the mirror that morning, he noticed something that filled him with an indescribable dread, a single ghostly white strand of hair, a physical toll of the price he had paid. As he went through the case files, he found that Sarah and Ben had been declared missing, joining Mark in a grim list of unsolved cases. Closure, it seemed, was a relative term. And so he sat there, the weight of his choices heavy on his shoulders, pondering the cost of unveiling the dark secrets that some places, like Alder Creek, so jealously guard. After all, every door that opens must also close, but the keys to such doors are never free, and Harris was left to wonder if the door he had sealed had trapped the evil inside, or if, in sealing it, he had become part of the darkness himself. Detective Harris continued to work on other cases, but Alder Creek remained in his thoughts like an itch he couldn't reach. Captain Miller sensed something was wrong, but knew better than to press. 2 months after the events at Alder Creek, Harris received an anonymous package at his doorstep. Inside was a series of photos, pictures of Emily before she died, pictures of the shed where they found the knife in Sarah's purse, and a photo of a door that looked eerily like the one Emily had drawn. A note was attached. "The door isn't closed, only locked, and keys can be copied." His blood ran cold at the implications. That night, Harris couldn't sleep. The ticking of the clock seemed to echo the beating of his heart, each tick a reminder of the terrible knowledge he possessed. Despite the risks, he drove to Alder Creek, now more fearful of the unknown watcher than of the place itself. As he stood there, he noticed something glinting in the water. Wading in, he retrieved it. Another locket. This one had a photo of Emily. The other half was empty. As he looked up, his eyes met another pair watching him from the shadows. It was a woman, her face half concealed, but her eyes intensely familiar. "Who are you?" he demanded. "A friend," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. Or perhaps a warning. "Choose your path carefully, detective. Once you walk through certain doors, they never fully close behind you." Before he could respond, she disappeared into the night, leaving him alone with his thoughts, and a growing realization that the story of Alder Creek was far from over. Back at the precinct, Harris couldn't shake off the encounter. While poring over files of missing persons, he found an old case from decades ago. A young woman who bore a striking resemblance to Emily had disappeared near Alder Creek. He reached out to local authorities in other states, and the pattern was chilling. Similar stories spread over years, all connected by a single thread: Alder Creek. He placed Emily's locket in a box along with the incantation and the anonymous photos. As he closed the box, he realized he was sealing away more than just evidence. He was locking away a part of himself, a part that would forever question the nature of good and evil, of doors opened and closed, and of the delicate balance between this world and whatever lay beyond. Alder Creek had exacted its toll. The door was locked, but as the anonymous note had warned, keys can be copied. And as he looked at his reflection one more time, noticing yet another white strand of hair, he wondered how many copies were out there, and how many doors were still waiting to be opened. Detective Jane Lewis had seen better days. The hours were long, the coffee was weak, and the police station was perpetually buzzing with the noise of ringing phones, chatter, and the occasional detainee shouting from the holding cells. She was drowning in a sea of paper: missing persons reports, cold cases, crime scene photos, and an endless array of administrative forms that only seemed to multiply. Jane glanced at the clock. It was almost midnight. She rubbed her temples and considered calling it a night when her phone buzzed on the desk. The caller ID was hidden. The words "unknown number" flashed on the screen. She hesitated for a moment, but ultimately picked up the call. "Detective Lewis speaking," she said, trying to keep the fatigue out of her voice. A shaky voice on the other end responded, almost too quiet to hear. "There's a house that eats people alive. 342 Willow Street stopped them before the next moon." A cold shiver went down Jane's spine, the kind you get when you feel like you're being watched. "Who is this? Can you elaborate?" Click. The line went dead. The message was cryptic, the voice tinged with fear, or was it a warning? The mention of the next moon filled her with an ominous dread. She quickly searched online to confirm what she already suspected. There was going to be a lunar eclipse in 3 days. Folktales and myths often associated lunar eclipses with dark, unexplainable phenomena. She grabbed her coat and hat. 342 Willow Street was located in a sleepy suburban neighborhood, a stark contrast to the haunting message she had received. She had passed through the area countless times. It was unremarkable, filled with rows of nearly identical houses, playgrounds, and dog parks. As she sat in her car, she found herself at a crossroads of her own judgment. She had two options: go home and dismiss the call as a hoax, or check out 342 Willow Street and potentially stop an unspeakable horror. Her gut told her to investigate. Prank or not, she couldn't shake off the dire urgency in the caller's voice. Jane turned the ignition and steered the car towards Willow Street. As she drove, her mind raced with possibilities. What did the voice mean by a house that eats people? Was this some deranged serial killer's lair? Or was she walking into something far more sinister, a dark abyss she couldn't yet fathom? As she reached the bottom, she was met with a gruesome sight. The walls were covered in arcane symbols, painted in what looked like dried blood. Chains hung from the ceiling, and in the center of it all was an old wooden chair fitted with leather restraints. Her flashlight then caught something glinting in the corner of the room. She approached to find a metal box. Swallowing hard, she opened it. Inside were personal belongings: driver's licenses, wedding rings, and small trinkets. All the IDs bore smiling faces, but what chilled her to the core was the realization that she recognized some of them. They were locals who had gone missing over the years, their cases gone cold. Jane felt her phone vibrate in her pocket, another call from an unknown number. "Do you believe now, Detective Lewis? Time is running out. The next moon approaches." The voice was cold, devoid of any emotion. This was no joke. Whoever was behind this had lured her into a chamber of horrors, a grim tapestry of human suffering. She needed to act, and fast. Taking photos of the room and the box of belongings as evidence, she rushed out of the house, her mind racing. She had to find out who lived here, who owned this property, and most importantly, who had tipped her off. Was it a victim seeking justice or the perpetrator toying with her? As she got into her car, she realized that she had stumbled upon something far larger and more terrifying than she could have ever imagined. The secrets of 342 Willow Street were just the tip of the iceberg, and as the next moon approached, Jane knew she was the only one who could prevent whatever unspeakable act was being planned. The clock was ticking, and the stakes had never been higher. Jane rushed back to the precinct, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. She needed to figure out who had tipped her off and what their intentions were. The secrets unearthed from 342 Willow Street couldn't be ignored, but unraveling them was like pulling on a thread from a much larger, darker tapestry. Her colleague, Detective Mike Harris, greeted her with a raised eyebrow as she burst into the office. "What's got you so worked up?" Jane didn't know how much she could trust anyone at this point. She opted for caution. "Just a lead on an old case," she said, brushing him off. She locked herself in her office and started sifting through property records for the abandoned house. She found the most recent owner, a man named Arthur Williams, who had died in a car crash almost 2 decades ago. The property had been tied up in probate court ever since. Jane's eyes narrowed. Arthur Williams had a daughter, Ava, who went missing around the same time as her father's death. The case was never solved. Jane felt a sense of dread wash over her. She had to confront the uncomfortable possibility that Ava's disappearance and the macabre scene in the basement were connected. Could Ava have been a victim, or worse, was she involved? Pulling up a cold case file, Jane found Ava's last known photo. She was a young girl, no older than 14 at the time of her disappearance, with bright blue eyes that seemed to harbor a well of untold secrets. The picture unsettled Jane, but she couldn't put her finger on why. Just then, her computer pinged. An email notification from an encrypted server. No subject. Hesitant but intrigued, she opened it. The message contained a single line. "She knows more than you think. You should ask her." Chills raced down Jane's spine. She grabbed her coat and gun, racing against time. Someone was pushing her towards the truth, but who? And why now? As she drove towards Ava's last known address, the words from the email echoed in her mind. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. Old wounds were reopening, but the promise of resolution, of justice, compelled her forward. Ava's childhood home was a crumbling ruin, long since abandoned. As Jane stepped onto the property, she felt an overwhelming sense of déjà vu. It was as if the land itself remembered her, whispering old secrets that were desperate to be free. And somewhere, deep within those walls, lay the truth. A truth that could either set her free or shackle her to the past forever. With a heavy heart and a prayer on her lips, Jane approached the old wooden door. This was it, the point of no return. She slowly turned the knob and stepped inside. The air was thick with the musty smell of decay and neglect, but beneath it was something else, fear. And in that moment, she knew she was not alone. The moment Jane stepped into the decrepit house, a shiver ran down her spine. Shadows danced on the walls as if mocking her presence. She unholstered her gun and moved cautiously, every creak of the floorboards magnifying her anxiety. Jane made her way through the narrow corridor to a room that appeared to be an office. Dusty files lay scattered on the ground, and an old computer sat on the desk. She froze when she noticed something out of place. A recently used ashtray with a smoldering cigarette. Just then, her radio crackled to life. "Detective Williams, this is dispatch. We have an anonymous tip regarding Ava Williams. Are you available to proceed?" Jane's eyes widened in disbelief. "Another anonymous tip?" She replied affirmatively and listened intently. "The tip suggests you check the basement, and be careful, detective." A chill ran down Jane's spine. The basement, of course. With great trepidation, she made her way downstairs. The creaking steps seemed to groan in agony, as if warning her not to proceed. But she had come too far to turn back now. At the bottom, she found a heavy metal door rusted from years of neglect. Taking a deep breath, she pushed it open. To her horror, she was met with a nightmarish sight. Shackles hanging from the walls, disturbing drawings, and in the center, an old chair stained with what looked like blood. Just as she was absorbing the grim scene, her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. She was here, and she will be again. Suddenly, the room went pitch black. The door slammed shut behind her, plunging her into darkness. Panic surged through Jane as she fumbled for her flashlight. The beam pierced the darkness, revealing something even more horrifying. The chair was now empty. Had someone been sitting there all along? The realization chilled her to the bone. Jane's instinct told her to flee, but her sense of duty rooted her to the spot. She had to find out the truth. Suddenly a voice echoed in the room. Soft, melodic, but tinged with madness. "Jane, is it? You should never have come here." The flashlight flickered and went out, and Jane felt a presence behind her. She spun around, gun ready, but found nothing. And then she heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps quickly retreating. The door creaked open just enough to let in a sliver of light. Seizing the opportunity, Jane bolted for the door and threw it open, her heart pounding in her chest. As she made her way back to the car, she felt like she was being watched. She looked around but saw no one. She knew, however, that the nightmare was far from over. Ava was alive, and she had a lot of explaining to do. Jane's heart was racing as she pulled up to Ava's home. There were too many questions, and every instinct she had told her that Ava was the key to them all. She knocked on the door and waited, trying to shake off the haunting images from the basement. The door creaked open and Ava stood there, eyes hollow as if she'd seen a ghost. "Detective Williams," she stammered. "I wasn't expecting you." Jane stepped inside. "We need to talk, Ava." Ava led her to the living room and gestured to a seat. "Would you like some tea?" "No, thank you. Let's cut to the chase. What were you doing at that house? The one from the anonymous tip?" Ava's eyes widened. "I don't know what you're talking about." Jane pulled out her phone and showed Ava the text message. "She was here and she will be again. Was this you?" Ava broke down. "Okay, I'll tell you everything, but you have to promise to protect me." After a moment's hesitation, Jane nodded. "Go on." Ava took a deep breath. "My sister went missing 3 years ago. The police gave up the search, but I never did. I found her. In that basement." Jane felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "And you didn't report it?" Ava shook her head. "I was scared. Whoever did this is still out there, and they found me." "That doesn't excuse the fact that you kept this a secret." Ava started to sob. "I know, and I hate myself for it. But she's still there, Detective. My sister is still in that house. Not physically, but her spirit, her presence. It's trapped." Jane shook her head, trying to make sense of the situation. "Ava, you need to cooperate fully. Take me to your sister, wherever she may be." Jane had her hand on her gun as she and Ava approached the decrepit house. The air grew colder, the moon hidden behind ominous clouds. "Stay behind me," she instructed Ava, pushing the creaky door open. They moved cautiously, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. Ava led Jane to the basement door. "This is it," she whispered, her voice trembling. With one swift move, Jane kicked the door open. The darkness in the basement seemed thicker, as if swallowing the light from their flashlights. Ava pointed towards the far corner. "That's where I found her," she said, her voice barely audible. Jane moved cautiously, her flashlight illuminating an old, rusty cage. She felt her stomach turn as she noticed a necklace hanging from it, the same necklace Ava's sister used to wear. Just then, the room flooded with light. "Police, drop your weapons," yelled a voice. Officers rushed down the stairs, guns drawn. "Detective Williams, you're under arrest for the abduction and murder of multiple missing persons," one of them declared, handcuffing her. Jane looked at Ava in disbelief. "What is the meaning of this?" Ava's eyes met hers, a sinister smile forming on her lips. "You were getting too close, Detective. I had to protect my secret." "So it was you?" Ava nodded. "And now you're the one who's going to take the fall for it. No one will suspect the grieving sister." As Jane was led away, she couldn't shake the terror gripping her heart. She had unwittingly walked into a spider's web, and the spider had won. As Jane sat in the back of the police car, her eyes scanned the dark roads they drove past, each one eerier than the last. She had to figure out a way to escape and expose Ava, but time was running out. Just then, the car skidded to a halt, throwing her body against the partition. "What the hell?" she heard one of the officers mutter. They had received a sudden distress call. Another crime scene had been discovered, eerily similar to the ones Jane had been investigating. "Stay in the car," the officer told her, still handcuffed, before rushing out. This was her chance. Adrenaline pumping, Jane managed to wriggle her handcuffs under her feet to bring her hands to the front. She then used the sharp edge of her seatbelt to pick the lock. The officers were too busy securing the second crime scene. a dilapidated barn lit by the ominous glow of their flashlights, to notice her escape. She moved stealthily, using the darkness as her cover, her thoughts racing. She had to find evidence to implicate Ava. As she neared the barn, her eyes fell on a familiar sight, a necklace identical to the one she had seen earlier hanging from the door. Her heart sank. This was Ava's sick signature. Summoning all her courage, she entered the barn, praying she wouldn't find another victim. A ghastly smell met her nostrils, turning her stomach. What she found was worse than she had feared. Photographs, dozens of them, all featuring Ava's sister and other victims, their faces contorted in horror. But what caught her attention was a detailed drawing of the basement from Ava's house, the layout meticulously planned out. And beside it, a notebook filled with Ava's handwriting, describing her twisted actions and reasoning in horrifying detail. Just as Jane grabbed the notebook, she heard footsteps approaching. She hid, clutching the evidence against her chest, her heart pounding in terror. 2 officers entered the barn, followed by Ava, who was directing them. "Check over there," she said, gesturing towards the back of the barn. As Ava moved closer to where Jane was hiding, Jane took a deep breath. It was now or never. Lunging forward, she tackled Ava, knocking the wind out of her, the notebook flying from her grip and landing at the officer's feet. "I've been framed," Jane screamed as the officers aimed their guns at her. "Check the notebook, it's all in there." Hesitant, one of the officers picked it up, flipping through its disturbing contents. His eyes widened in horror as he read, finally realizing the monster Ava truly was. Ava glared at Jane, her eyes filled with malevolence and defeat. "You may have won this time, detective, but remember, evil never dies, it just changes form." Jane, panting, looked into her eyes and said, "And justice never sleeps. You're under arrest, Ava." As Ava was led away, her deranged smile sent a shiver down Jane's spine. This was far from over, but for now the spider had been caught in her own web. The Whitman mansion was an imposing edifice, built in the late 1800s by a family of unimaginable wealth and shadowy history. It sat atop a hill, shrouded by twisted trees and ancient foliage, commanding a dark allure that equally attracted and repelled visitors. Tonight, however, the family's long, twisted driveway was occupied by only the most intimate of family, John Whitman and his 2 sons, Daniel and Richard. Inside, the mansion's walls seemed to close in on itself. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood and musty antiques. John, the aging patriarch, sat behind a massive oak desk in the study. His stern face was as severe as the antiquities that surrounded him. Before him stood Daniel and Richard, both middle-aged but worlds apart in demeanor. Daniel, the elder, was the epitome of sophistication and confidence, while Richard seemed perennially uneasy, always in the shadow of his more successful sibling. John cleared his throat as he looked down at his will, a legal document that was about to change the course of the Whitman legacy. "Boys, you know why you're here. It's time to discuss the inheritance." A look of indignation crossed Richard's face, but he said nothing. "I've decided that the bulk of the family estate will go to Daniel. He has been steadfast and responsible, upholding the Whitman name." Daniel nodded appreciatively, but Richard's face turned a hue darker, bordering on crimson. His jaw tightened as he gripped the armrest of his chair. John looked directly into Richard's eyes, but his voice was as cold as the grave. "You will not be left out, Richard, but you will not be handed the keys to the kingdom, so to speak." It was then that all 3 men glanced up at the ancestral portrait that hung on the wall. The faces of their forefathers seemed to look down upon them with harsh judgment, their eyes almost lifelike, burning with an inner fire. It was said that the portrait was painted with a mix of pigments and soil from the Whitman ancestral burial ground, adding to its eerie realism. "Let the past be a lesson to both of you," John continued, breaking the awkward silence. "Our family legacy is both a gift and a curse. Don't take it lightly." Richard clenched his fists, feeling the weight of generations of Whitmans glaring down at him, judging him. For him, the family legacy was about to take a dark, unforgivable turn. The room seemed to close in, and the eyes in the ancestral portrait appeared to flicker with approval or perhaps forewarning. It was hard to say. The decisions made in that room would set off a chain of events so horrendous that it would make even the most stoic of Whitmans roll in their graves. Richard left the study, his heart pounding as he walked down the grand hallway adorned with gold-trimmed walls and opulent chandeliers. He paused in front of a large mirror framed in gold leaf, seeing not just his reflection but the endless chain of Whitmans that preceded him. The room spun for a moment, but he steadied himself. He had a plan, one that would ensure his share of the family legacy, whatever the cost. He proceeded to a little used section of the mansion. The air grew colder with every step. His eyes fell on the door at the end of the hall, behind which was his private study, a room few knew about and even fewer had entered. Richard unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was filled with trinkets of occult and esoteric knowledge, books of arcane lore, mysterious artifacts, and unsettling works of art. And there, in the center of the room, was a desk littered with documents, notes, and photographs. Among those photos was one of Sophie, Daniel's 19-year-old daughter, Richard's niece. She was a brilliant young woman, an emerging artist full of promise, her eyes full of innocence and a future untarnished by the malevolent Whitman history. Richard felt a pang of guilt as he looked at her image, but he quickly suppressed it. "Sophie, dear Sophie," he mumbled, opening a drawer to reveal a tiny glass vial filled with a translucent liquid. "I wish it hadn't come to this. But desperate times call for desperate measures." Richard knew that kidnapping Sophie and holding her as leverage was an abhorrent plan. But the thoughts of finally stepping out of the shadows, of claiming his rightful place in the family legacy, were overwhelming. He had already arranged contacts that would ensure Sophie would disappear without a trace. And once he had control over the Whitman resources, he could guarantee her a safe, if secretive, life abroad. It was then that he felt it. The room seemed to grow darker, as if agreeing with his nefarious plan. A cold breeze whispered through the room, disturbing the ancient pages of the grimoires on the shelves. It was then that he felt it. The room seemed to grow darker, as if agreeing with his nefarious plan. A cold breeze whispered through the room, disturbing the ancient pages of the grimoires on the shelves. And for a fleeting moment, he could swear he heard a distant voice, a haunting, bone-chilling whisper. "Careful what you wish for." Richard looked at the portrait on the wall. It was an old Whitman ancestor, Bartholomew Whitman, known in family folklore as a warlock who had practiced the dark arts. The eyes in the portrait seemed to come alive for a moment, sending shivers down Richard's spine. "I have no choice," Richard muttered, almost trying to justify himself to the ancestral spirits that he felt were watching him. Just then, the glass vial levitated from the table, hovering in the air before dropping back down, as if nudged by some invisible hand. "Okay, I get it. I won't go through with it," Richard burst out, his voice tinged with both fear and relief. But as he sat there contemplating the sheer horror of what he'd been willing to do, Richard knew deep down that the malevolent legacy of the Whitmans had not finished its work, not by a long shot. The line between morality and monstrosity had just been crossed, and there would be no turning back. Sophie Whitman sat in her room, focused on her canvas. Her paintbrush moved in seamless strokes as she lost herself in the art. She was unaware of the vile plans that had been conceived for her, yet something felt off. A nagging sensation of being watched had crept into her subconscious. Downstairs, Daniel, her father and Richard's older brother, was in the living room talking business with potential clients. As Daniel discussed mergers and stocks, Sophie felt her room grow colder. The light flickered for a moment and she felt it, a presence, malign and unseen. "Is anyone there?" she called out, setting her brush down. No answer. Her eyes went to the window. The curtain fluttered, though the window was closed. As she approached it, her eyes met a reflection in the glass, but it wasn't hers. It was distorted, a ghastly shadow that sent shivers down her spine. She blinked and it was gone. Just then, her phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "You don't know me, but your life is in danger. Trust no one." Sophie was about to dismiss it as a prank when she saw another message. "Check the third book from the right on the second shelf of your living room bookcase, page 72. Confused and intrigued, Sophie made her way to the living room. "Hey, Sophie, join us," Daniel said, spotting her. "In a moment, Dad," she replied, walking briskly to the bookcase and quickly finding the specified book. Turning to page 72, she found an old photograph tucked in between the pages. It was a picture of Richard and a group of shady-looking individuals, standing in front of a boarded-up building known to be a haven for criminal activities. Her heart raced. The image dated back years, but the implications were horrifying. Sophie quickly snapped a photo of the image with her phone and replaced the book just as Daniel concluded his business meeting. Her mind raced with questions as she returned to her room. Who sent the message? How did they know about the photograph? And most importantly, what did Richard have to do with all this? Sophie was resolute, fear and determination intertwined like the helices of her DNA. Her phone was her weapon, her lifeline. She dialed the only person she could trust at this point, her tech-savvy best friend, Lucy. Lucy was a brilliant hacker, a digital wanderer who had a way of ferreting out the deepest, darkest secrets hidden in the labyrinthine corridors of the web. Her skills were borderline illegal, but Sophie was desperate. Shaking, she forwarded the incriminating photo to Lucy and sat on the edge of her bed, biting her nails to the quick as she waited for a response. Minutes felt like hours until finally, Lucy's text popped up, its tone uncharacteristically serious. "Oh my God, Soph, this is next level messed up. Seriously, what the hell is going on? I don't know, but can you find out who these people are? I need to know, and it has to be fast," Sophie texted back, her fingers flying across the screen. Within an agonizing hour, Lucy had unearthed information that chilled Sophie to her very core. The men photographed with her Uncle Richard were not just ordinary criminals. They were part of a sprawling underworld network, involved in horrifying enterprises that ranged from human trafficking to illegal arms trading. "Soph, this is bigger than we thought. You need to get out of there. Get to somewhere safe, and I'm calling the police," Lucy urged, punctuating her message with a siren emoji for dramatic effect. Sophie's stomach felt like it had folded in on itself. Could Richard, her own flesh and blood, be entangled in something so dark, so horrific? Her mind was racing, considering the best escape routes when she heard it. Footsteps. Slow, methodical steps ascending the stairs, coming closer to her bedroom door. She rose to her feet, her eyes darting around the room for an escape route or a hiding place. But it was too late. The door swung open and there stood Richard. His eyes not the warm, familial eyes she remembered, but cold, dead eyes that seemed to pierce right through her. His hand gripped a syringe filled with a liquid that glinted ominously under the room's dim light. "Sophie, it's time we had a little chat," he said, his voice dripping with an eerie calmness that was more frightening than any display of anger could have been. Sophie's pulse quickened, her eyes darting towards the window. The otherworldly shriek had seemed to momentarily paralyze Richard. Seizing the opportunity, she lunged for her desk, grabbing a paperweight. With a swift motion, she hurled it at Richard, who ducked just in time. The distraction, however, was enough for her to bolt out of the room. Down the hallway she sprinted, her feet pounding against the wooden floor as she thought, where to go? Where to go? Her mind raced, attempting to solve this real-time puzzle of life and death. "Lucy told me to go somewhere safe, but where is safe in a house full of traps?" she thought as she reached the landing of the stairs. It was then she remembered the old panic room built by her late grandfather, a room Richard probably thought she had forgotten. She pushed the bookshelf aside and entered the room, sealing the door behind her. Minutes later, she heard footsteps in the study. It was Richard, cursing under his breath as he pulled books from the shelves, clearly looking for some sign of her. Then he stopped. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as she watched him walk toward the bookshelf that concealed her. Suddenly, he yanked it aside and approached the panic room door. He seemed to contemplate it for a moment, then produced another syringe from his pocket. "You can't hide forever, Sophie," he said, a hint of pleasure lacing his voice. "This room isn't as impenetrable as you think." Sophie blinked, trying to adjust to her dim surroundings. The last thing she remembered was Richard's voice and then the quick, sharp sting of a needle. Now she was here, in a room that seemed less like a part of her family home and more like a chamber of horrors. Bound to an antique wooden chair, her wrists chafing against rough ropes, she took in the grim spectacle around her. The room was filled with disturbing artifacts. A collection of dolls with eyes either missing or scratched out stared at her as if in judgment. Antique surgical tools lay rusted and blood-stained on a wooden table, and satanic symbols were etched onto the walls, pulsating as if they were breathing. It was as if the room was a living entity, each item contributing to an aura of malevolence that seemed to suffocate the air. Then, she heard it, the soft, eerie whispering. The voices seemed to come from all directions, chanting incantations in a language Sophie couldn't recognize. The whispers grew louder, forming a dissonant chorus that filled the room. Sophie felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the walls were closing in on her. Suddenly, the door creaked open and Richard stepped in. His face was twisted, not in anger, but in a perverse kind of excitement. "I see you've awakened," he said, his voice still maintaining that unnerving calm. "I thought it was high time you joined the family business." "Family business?" Sophie gasped, struggling against her restraints. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" Richard chuckled. "Oh, it's no joke. Our family legacy isn't just wealth and status, Sophie, it's power. The kind of power most people can't even fathom, let alone wield. Sophie felt her stomach churn as Richard began to arrange the ancient surgical tools on a table beside her. You see, our ancestors made certain pacts that grant us great advantages in life. But such power doesn't come without a price. It demands sacrifices, he said, his eyes flicking towards a dagger with an ornate hilt, stained with what Sophie could only assume was blood. As he picked it up, Sophie felt the room respond. The whispering voices grew ecstatic. The satanic symbols on the walls glowed brighter, and the air thickened with an oppressive darkness. Richard raised the dagger, his eyes alight with an unholy fire. Just as he was about to strike, the room shuddered. An unseen force seemed to seize him, jerking the dagger from his hand and sending it clattering to the floor. The whispering voices turned into screams of rage, and the symbols on the wall flickered as if in distress. Richard's eyes widened in disbelief. What is happening? This isn't possible. Sophie held her breath as she watched him turn slowly to face whatever horror had produced that sound. His eyes widened in terror at the sight that met him. A spectral figure, face twisted in an anguished expression, hovered at the room walls. Sophie didn't know what it was or where it came from, but she didn't care. She knew one thing. This horror, whatever it was, had saved her life. Richard screamed, turning to run, but the entity lunged, engulfing him in a swirl of darkness that seemed to absorb him whole. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished, leaving an empty, trembling silence in its wake. The room fell silent. The symbols on the wall dimmed, the whispers ceased, and even the air seemed to relax its grip. It was as if the room had made its choice. Sophie felt her restraints loosen, as if the room itself had decided to release her. Scrambling to her feet, she lunged for the dagger. With a swift motion, she cut the remaining ropes binding her. Sophie reached the door and took one last look at the room. I may not be able to escape my legacy, she said, stepping out and shutting the door behind her. But I can damn well fight it. With that, she locked the door, leaving the dark room, surrounded by the artifacts of a legacy that had just been defied. With the room now locked, Sophie knew she had to act fast. The house was no longer a sanctuary. It was a lair for dark secrets and darker intentions. Clutching the dagger, she raced down the dim hallways, her mind racing faster than her feet. She needed to find Lucy and get out as fast as they could. Sophie burst into her room and grabbed her phone. There was a message from Lucy. Where are you? I called the cops. Sophie felt a glimmer of hope. She texted back, Lucy, get out of the house. Go somewhere safe. I'll find you. Leaving her room, Sophie stopped dead in her tracks. The house, once filled with the sounds of ticking clocks and creaking wood, was now echoing with police sirens and hurried footsteps. Officers were entering, their faces serious, their guns drawn. Before she could even think to run, Sophie felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see an officer, his face stern but concerned. Are you all right? We received an urgent call, he said. Sophie looked at the officer. I am now, she said, realizing that while the past could not be changed, the future was hers to decide. And she had just made her first choice, to fight the darkness, both within and around her. Sophie explained what had happened as best as she could, though she left out the part about the spectral figure. She knew it was something beyond conventional understanding. 2 officers stayed with her in the living room while the rest of the team searched the house. They found Richard's phone and wallet, but there was no sign of him or the entity that had consumed him. Sophie was transported to the station, where she provided a full statement. Lucy joined her, acting as a source of emotional support and corroborating Sophie's claims of Richard's dark activities. While awaiting an update, Sophie's phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. I see you found the room. Pity that you had to use it. Just remember, Sophie, some doors are best left unopened. Sophie looked at Lucy. Did you send this? No, why would I? Lucy's eyes widened as she read the message. Soph, this isn't good. A detective walked in. Sophie, we've done some digging. The men in the photo with your uncle were known criminals, but all of them have disappeared in the past year. We believe they were part of a criminal network that has been abducting people for various illegal activities. Sophie felt a chill run down her spine. If what she suspected was true, Richard had been consumed by the very darkness he had courted. And one more thing, the detective added. We found something in your grandfather's old study, a journal. It's filled with esoteric rituals and accounts of communicating with otherworldly entities. I think you should take a look. As Sophie flipped through the pages, her eyes widened in disbelief. Her grandfather had not only known about the spectral figure, but had summoned it years ago as a form of protection, a guardian of sorts. Yet he cautioned that this entity was a double-edged sword, a creature from the abyss that could turn on its summoner. Sophie looked up from the journal, her eyes meeting Lucy's. They both knew that the horror was far from over. The entity, once summoned, could not be easily banished. Richard had unleashed something that neither chains nor walls could contain. "Are you okay?" the detective asked, observing Sophie's pale face. Sophie nodded. "I will be. I have to be. The abyss has been unveiled, and now it's my legacy to confront it." Though the immediate threat had been averted, Sophie knew that she had stepped into a realm of darkness that few could fathom. Her fight was far from over, and the abyss, once gazed upon, would gaze back into her, testing the limits of her courage in the horrifying chapters yet to unfold. Sophie returned to her family mansion, now cordoned off as a crime scene. She was allowed a brief visit to collect personal belongings. Her eyes were drawn to her grandfather's study, the room where it all began. "Soph, are you sure about this?" Lucy asked, her voice tinged with fear and concern. Sophie gripped the journal in her hands. "I have to end this, Lucy. Otherwise it will never be over." They entered the study, the air dense with an atmosphere of unspoken dread. Sophie opened her grandfather's journal to the page detailing the ritual for containing the entity. "We need a circle of salt, 7 black candles, and the sigil drawn in charcoal," Sophie explained. As Lucy began to gather the items, Sophie started to draw the intricate sigil on the wooden floor. Once everything was in place, they stood in the circle and lit the candles. Sophie began to recite the incantation written in the journal. The room grew colder, and the flickering candlelight seemed to be swallowed by the growing darkness. A guttural growl filled the air, echoing from the walls as if in response to the incantation. "Sophie, I don't know if we should," Lucy began, but Sophie cut her off. "We have to finish it." With a final shout, Sophie concluded the incantation. The room shook as if hit by an invisible force, and the entity materialized before them. It was a swirling mass of darkness, a black void with crimson eyes that radiated malevolence. "Do you think you can bind me?" it hissed, its voice a chorus of agony. Sophie held up the journal. "My grandfather could, and so can I." With a scream that shook the very foundations of the house, the entity lunged at Sophie. But just before it could reach her, it collided with an invisible barrier formed by the circle of salt. It howled in frustration and pain as it was pulled into the sigil on the floor, which glowed an intense white. Sophie slammed the journal shut, and the entity let out a final defeated screech as it was sucked into the pages, the sigil acting like a vortex that contained its form. As quickly as it had appeared, it vanished, leaving only the scent of burnt ozone and extinguished candles. Both girls fell to the floor, exhausted but alive. Sophie looked at her best friend, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. "We did it, Lucy," Sophie said, her voice barely a whisper. "Yeah, but at what cost?" Lucy asked, looking around the room that had once belonged to her grandfather, now a tomb of dark secrets. Sophie closed her eyes, clutching the journal to her chest. "Some doors are best left unopened," she murmured, realizing that while they had closed this particular door, many others lay ahead, waiting in the shadows of her haunted legacy. Sophie knew her journey was far from over, but for the first time she felt ready to face whatever darkness lay ahead. With Lucy by her side and the knowledge of her grandfather's journal to guide her, she would stand vigilant against the abyss, whatever form it chose to take. In the shadows of the night, if our tales from Unsettling Horror Stories gave you a fright, press like and let it be known. Subscribe, so you're never alone in this haunting journey, and share, so others too can be wary. Until our next sinister tale, stay dark, dear listener.